The morning Nellie Cooper arrived in Dust Creek, New Mexico Territory. The year was 1878. The sun was already merciless, and she had exactly $1.43 to her name, which was, as it turned out, precisely 43 cents more than the man who would change her life forever. She stepped down from the hired wagon that had carried her from Santa Fe, her brown leather traveling bag clutched in both hands, her dark hair pinned beneath a sun-faded bonnet, and she stood in the middle of what could only generously be called a main street. It was more of a wide dirt path flanked by wooden buildings, some of which looked as though a firm sneeze might collapse them entirely. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon with a sign that read Carver's in peeling red paint, and a land office that appeared to have been recently nailed together from whatever spare lumber the carpenter had left over after building everything else. The whole town smelled of horse sweat, dry earth, and something faintly metallic that she could not quite identify. Nellie was 24 years old, recently widowed, and had traveled from Tennessee with a plan so fragile she hardly dared think about it too directly, the way you might not look straight at the sun. Her husband, James Cooper, had died of fever the previous winter, leaving her with a modest farmstead that his brother had promptly claimed through legal maneuvering she hadn't the money to fight. She had packed what remained of her dignity and her belongings, and decided that the territory was where a woman with nothing left to lose might find something worth having. What she had not planned for was arriving 3 days late, discovering that the woman she was supposed to board with had left for California, and finding herself standing in the middle of Dust Creek with $1.43 and absolutely no notion of what to do next. She was still standing there, turning slowly on her heel and taking stock of her options, when the door of Carver's saloon swung open and a man stumbled out, caught himself on the porch railing, and then straightened up with the particular dignity of someone who has been embarrassed but refuses to fully acknowledge it. Homer Redmond was 28 years old, 6 feet even, lean in the way that hard work and sparse meals make a man lean, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes that had a habit of looking at things for longer than was entirely comfortable. He wore a dusty brown hat, work-worn boots, and a canvas shirt that had seen considerably better days. He was not drunk, which was notable given that he had just come out of a saloon, but he wore the expression of a man who had received news he had not wanted. He saw her standing there in the street, and for a moment neither of them said anything. There was a quality to that silence that was different from ordinary silence, something that neither of them could have articulated at the time, though later, looking back, they would each independently describe it as the feeling of a gear settling into place. "You lost?" he asked, because it was the most practical thing he could think of, and Homer Redmond was, at his core, a practical man. "Not lost," Nellie said. "Simply without a destination, which is technically different." He came down the 3 porch steps and stood on the street level with her. Up close, she could see that his eyes were not simply dark but a deep shade of brown with flecks of amber, and that he had a jaw that was set in a manner suggesting he made decisions and stuck to them. "You come in on Denny's wagon?" he asked. "Yes. I was meant to stay with a Mrs. Eliza Harmon. Do you know her?" Homer's expression shifted. "Mrs. Harmon left town about 6 weeks ago. Her nephew came out from Baltimore and convinced her to go back east." He paused. "You didn't know?" "Evidently not." Nellie set her bag down on the ground and pressed her hands to her lower back, which ached from the long ride. "I wrote to her. She must have already left by the time my letter arrived." "Where are you from?" "Tennessee originally. Santa Fe most recently." She looked at him steadily. "I don't suppose you know of anyone in this town who might have a room available for a respectable widow woman." Homer considered this, looking up the street and then down it as though the buildings might offer suggestions. "Ma Guthrie takes boarders sometimes. Her place is at the north end of town. She's particular, but she's fair." He picked up her bag before she could protest. "I'll walk you." She ought to have objected to a stranger handling her bag, but the practical part of her mind, which had been running the show lately, given the circumstances, pointed out that she was alone in an unfamiliar town, and this man had the look of someone who was honest, which was a quality she had learned to identify quickly in the aftermath of her brother-in-law's legal maneuvering. "I'm Nellie Cooper," she said as they walked. "Homer Redmond." He didn't offer his hand because both of his were occupied with her bag, but he tipped his hat slightly. "I've got a claim about 4 miles east of town. Been working it for 2 years. A homestead claim. Under the Homestead Act, yes." He said it with a certain quiet pride that she recognized. It was the pride of someone who had worked hard for something and knew exactly what it had cost. 160 acres. Good soil along the creek bed, decent elevation above the flood line. I've got 12 acres under cultivation. "What do you grow?" "Wheat mostly. Some corn." "I've been trying to get a kitchen garden going, but—" He paused, and something flickered across his face that she couldn't quite read. "It's been a harder year than expected." They reached Ma Guthrie's boarding house, which was a more substantial building than most in Dusk Creek, white-painted, with a proper porch and window boxes that had clearly once held flowers but currently held only dirt. Ma Guthrie herself answered the door on the second knock, a broad, capable woman of about 60 with iron-gray hair and the evaluating gaze of someone who had seen everything and been fooled by none of it. "Mrs. Guthrie," Homer said. "This is Mrs. Cooper. She's new to town and needs a room. She was meant to board with Eliza Harmon." Ma Guthrie looked at Nellie for a long, considering moment. "Room's $2 a week, breakfast and supper included." "No men past the parlor." Nellie hesitated. $2 a week. With $1.43 she could manage perhaps 4 days. After that she would need income, and income required either employment or her land claim, which she had applied for in Santa Fe but which had not yet been approved. "I have 1 week's funds available immediately," Nellie said, deciding that honesty was more dignified than evasion. "I expect to receive approval of my homestead claim within the fortnight, at which point I can make longer arrangements." Ma Guthrie studied her again. "You filed a homestead claim?" "Yes, ma'am. Section 12, Township 7, east of Mr. Redmond's claim as I understand the survey maps." Something shifted in Ma Guthrie's expression, something that was almost approval. "I'll take 1 week in advance and we'll speak again at the end of it." She stepped back to let Nellie in, then glanced at Homer. "You eating supper here tonight, Homer?" "Not tonight, Ma, thank you." He handed Nellie's bag through the door. He looked at Nellie, and there was a directness to the look that she found both unexpected and oddly steadying. "I hope the town treats you well, Mrs. Cooper." "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Redmond." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and walked back down the street. Nellie watched him go for a moment longer than she intended before Ma Guthrie cleared her throat meaningfully and ushered her inside. The next morning, Nellie was up before sunrise, sitting at the small desk in her room with the window cracked open to let in the cool pre-dawn air, writing in her notebook, and listing her situation with the ruthless clarity she had found was the only way to avoid despair. She had $1.43. She had filed a homestead claim that had not yet been approved. She had no tools, no seeds, no livestock, no employment, and 4 days of room and board. She had 2 strong hands, a great deal of knowledge about farming. Her father had been a farmer in eastern Tennessee, and she had worked beside him from the time she could walk, and a stubbornness that had been described by various people in her life as both her greatest strength and her most exhausting quality. She was at the general store when it opened at 7 in the morning, examining seed packets with the careful attention of a woman who knows exactly what each variety requires and what each variety produces per acre, when she heard the door open behind her and turned to find Homer Redmond standing at the counter, speaking with the store's owner, a Mr. Abelard Webb. "The price went up again," Homer was saying, his voice quiet but carrying a tightness that Nellie recognized as controlled frustration. "Everything goes up, Homer. The freight company raised their rates again last month. Soda's 20 cents a pound now, flour's near 30. I can't help what it costs to bring things out here." "I know it." Homer set something on the counter, a small canvas pouch, and Nellie, without meaning to watched him count out coins carefully. The amount was small, very small. She turned her attention back to the seed display, but she was thinking now. Her mind was the kind that could hold two things at once, and while one part of it was calculating the yield-to-cost ratio of winter wheat versus drought-resistant sorghum, the other part was turning over what she had just seen, a man counting coins with the care of someone counting the last of something. She made her small purchase, a single packet of tomato seeds, 5 cents, because she could not help herself, and went outside. Homer was already there, loading a few items into the back of a weathered buckboard wagon. His horse was a strong-looking roan with a patient temperament and a scar along its left flank. "Good morning, Mr. Redmond," she said. He looked up. "Mrs. Cooper." "Early start. I find mornings useful." She hesitated, then said, because the practical part of her mind insisted, "Is the store always that expensive?" He straightened up, something wry crossing his face. "Welcome to the territory. Everything has to come a long way." He studied her. "You said your claim is east of mine. Section 12, if the survey maps I looked at in Santa Fe were accurate." "I know Section 12. Good acreage. The creek cuts through the southern quarter and there's a stand of cottonwoods along the eastern edge." He paused. "Has good soil, sandier than mine but retains moisture better." She looked at him, surprised by the detail. "You know it well." "I know most of the land out here. 2 years of walking it will do that." He picked up the last item from the ground and set it in the wagon. "You planning to work it yourself?" "That is my intention, yes." He didn't say anything to that immediately, which she appreciated. Most men, in her experience, could not resist commenting on a woman alone attempting to work a homestead, and the comments ranged from well-meaning condescension to outright skepticism. Homer Redmond simply looked at her with those steady dark eyes as though he was assessing a practical situation rather than making a social judgment. "It's a good piece of land," he said finally. "You'll need to get out there and have a look before winter sets in. Make sure the soil is what you expect. I was planning to go this afternoon if I can borrow or hire a horse. I'm riding out that way after I finish at the mill." He said it simply, as though it was not at all a significant offer. "You're welcome to ride along if you want a guide." She considered this for exactly as long as it took her to determine that pride was a luxury she could not currently afford, and that a guide was genuinely useful. "I would appreciate that very much, Mr. Redmond." They met at the edge of town at 2 o'clock, Nellie having borrowed a horse from Ma Guthrie's small stable in exchange for a promise to help with the washing on Saturday, and they rode east together through the high desert landscape. The land was extraordinary, vast and rust-colored and alive in ways that were different from Tennessee's green abundance. The sage was silver-green and fragrant. Hawks circled in the updrafts. The mountains to the north were blue with distance and draped at their peaks with clouds that looked painted there. Nellie Cooper had not expected to find the territory beautiful. She had expected it to be survivable, which was a different thing entirely. But riding through the afternoon light with the smell of sage and the sound of her horse's steady hoofbeats, she felt something that she identified, with some surprise, as hope. They didn't talk constantly, which she found comfortable rather than awkward. Homer pointed out landmarks, a particular rock formation, the track of an old wagon road, a distant windmill that marked the Peralta family's ranch. He spoke about the land with a knowledge that was clearly earned rather than theoretical, and she listened with genuine interest, asking questions when she had them. When they reached Section 12, she understood immediately what he had meant about it. The land rolled gently, not flat but not severe, and she could see where the creek cut through the southern portion, its banks shaded by the cottonwoods he had mentioned. The soil along the creek edge was darker, richer looking. The main acreage was sandy but with a good underlying structure that she tested by crouching down and working a handful of it between her palms. "It's good," she said quietly, looking out over the land with the sun lowering behind her, throwing long shadows across the ground. "It's really good." Homer had dismounted and was standing a few feet away, watching her evaluate the soil with an expression she couldn't quite see because of the angle of the light. "It is," he agreed. "I had my eye on this section myself, actually." She looked up at him sharply. "Before I made my claim on Section 11, he added quickly with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "There's no conflict. I'm settled on my ground, but I noticed this acreage when I was surveying the area. It has potential." She stood, brushing the soil from her hands. "You survey your own land. I have a transit and I know how to use it. When you're claiming land, it helps to understand what you're claiming." He was quiet for a moment. "My father was a surveyor in Kentucky. I learned from him." There was something in the way he said it that told her that his father was not a present-tense person, and she did not press. Instead, she walked the boundary of the section, noting the slope of the land, the drainage pattern, the location of a small rise on the northern edge that would offer a good building site. Homer walked with her, and they spoke about practical things: water access, plowing technique, what the winters were like in this part of the territory, which crops had done well in the area and which had failed. By the time they rode back to town in the darkening evening, she felt she knew him better than she had known most people she'd spoken with for considerably longer. He had a quality of attention. When he spoke, he meant it, and when he listened, he actually listened, that she found both rare and deeply comfortable. "Thank you," she said when they reached Ma Guthrie's stable. "That was genuinely helpful." "I hope your claim comes through soon," he said. "If it does, you'll want to break that ground before the first hard freeze." "When does that typically come?" "Late October if we're unlucky. November if we're not." He swung down from his horse and helped her down from hers, which was simply practical given that the borrowed saddle was set high. His hands were steady at her waist, and he released her the moment she had her feet under her, which she appreciated. "I'll be in town Saturday for supplies, if you think of any other questions." She found herself looking forward to Saturday more than the practical situation entirely warranted. 3 days later, her homestead claim was approved. The document arrived with the noon mail, and Nellie held the stiff government paper in both hands and read it 3 times to be sure it was real. 160 acres, Section 12, Township 7, Range 9 East, New Mexico Territory. Hers. Hers to work to prove up over the next 5 years to eventually own outright. She bought Ma Guthrie a small bottle of vanilla extract from the store in celebration and sat in her room that evening making careful, methodical plans. She needed seeds. She needed tools, at minimum a plow, a hoe, a rake, a good shovel. She needed lumber for a shelter. She needed food to sustain herself while she worked. She needed money for all of it, and she had, after the purchase of the tomato seeds and a few other necessities, approximately $1.10 remaining. The stage to Santa Fe, where she knew a woman who might offer her temporary work until she had enough money to fund the first season's planting, ran on Fridays. The fare was $1 each way. She thought about this for a long time that night. Saturday came, and with it Homer Redmond, riding into town in his buckboard, and the two of them fell into conversation outside the general store with the ease of people who had somehow, in the space of 2 meetings, established a comfortable frequency. He had brought a basket of late-season corn from his garden, some of which he sold to Webb's store, and some of which he gave to Ma Guthrie, and Nellie watched him do both transactions with the same straightforward manner he seemed to bring to everything. They sat on the bench outside the store afterward, in the warm Saturday morning, and she told him about the approval of her claim. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It opened briefly, the way a window opens and lets in light. "That's good news," he said, and she could hear that he meant it absolutely. "Yes." She turned the vanilla extract bottle in her hands, which she had brought along to return to Ma Guthrie. "I've been working out what I need for first planting, and the figures are significant. What are you short on?" She told him honestly, because she had discovered that honesty with him was not only natural but productive. She laid out the list: seeds, tools, basic materials for a temporary shelter, food for the weeks of work before any crop could help her. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he sat quietly for a moment with his elbows on his knees, looking at the dirt of the main street. "I know a man in Cimarron who sells good seed stock at fair prices," he said, "better than web charges, and I have tools you can borrow, a spare hoe and a rake that aren't being used. The plow is more of a problem." "The stage to Santa Fe runs Friday," she said. "I know a woman there who might put me to work for a few months. I could save enough to come back and fund a spring planting. It's not ideal, it means losing this fall for breaking ground, but it may be the only practical option." Homer looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that was more complex than she had seen from him before, something careful and also something that was trying not to be something else. "The stage fare is $1, he said. "Yes." A silence settled between them, different from the comfortable silences of the ride out to her land. This one had weight to it. "I have $1, Homer said slowly, and then stopped. She looked at him. $1, he repeated. "Which is everything I have until I sell the next load of wheat, which won't be for 3 weeks. He said this with perfect steadiness, as though he was reporting a weather forecast rather than the state of his entire financial situation. Homer. She used his first name without thinking about it, and neither of them remarked on it. "I wasn't asking you for, I know you weren't." He looked out at the street again. "I'm saying I have it. $1. If you need it for the stage fare, you should have it." The enormity of what he was saying landed on her slowly and then all at once. $1 was everything he had. She knew from the conversation at the store earlier in the week, from the careful way he spent and the way he described this year as harder than expected, that he was not a man with reserves. That dollar was his security for the next 3 weeks, his buffer against anything going wrong. "I can't take that," she said. "You can," he said simply. "It's yours if you need it. $1 isn't worth much against the kind of thing you're trying to build." She looked at him for a long moment. He was looking at the street, jaw set in that decided way, and she thought about what kind of man makes an offer like that, not as a loan, not with conditions, not with expectation, just as a plain statement of what he would do if she needed it. She thought about her husband James, who had been a decent man but not this kind of man. She thought about what she had come here to build and what she would have to give up to go to Santa Fe, and what she would be going back to, essentially, when she got there. She thought about Section 12, with its good dark soil along the creek and its cottonwoods standing patient in the afternoon light. She thought about the seed catalog she had been studying in her room at night by lamplight, about the winter wheat varieties that could be sown in October and overwinter successfully in this elevation, about the kitchen garden she had already mentally laid out along the southern slope where the soil was best. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "If you had another $1, just one more, on top of what you've got, what would you do with it?" He turned his head to look at her, the amber flecks catching in his dark eyes. A pause. Then, with what she thought might be the particular honesty of a man who has been asked a question that cuts right to the heart of something. "I'd buy seed. I need more winter wheat seed than I can afford this season." She looked at the dollar coin in his palm, which he had produced at some point during the conversation, and was holding with the flat matter-of-factness of someone who has decided something and isn't going to unsay it. And then Nellie Cooper made a decision that she did not analyze in the moment, but would think about for the rest of her life as the most important decision she had ever made. She reached out and took the dollar from his hand. She closed her fingers around it. She stood up. "Thank you," she said, and she walked, not toward Ma Guthrie's boarding house, but in the direction of the general store. Homer sat on the bench and watched her go with an expression he couldn't organize properly, something between confusion and a feeling he couldn't name. She was in the store for 20 minutes. When she came back out, she was carrying a small paper sack with both hands, and her expression was one he had not yet seen on her face, something blazing and decided, and a little bit terrified all at once. She sat back down beside him on the bench and set the sack on her knee. "I bought seed," she said. He stared at her. "Winter wheat," she continued, her voice steady even though her hands were not entirely, "and a small amount of rye, and enough garden seed to start the kitchen plot in spring. Mr. Webb gave me a fair price. She paused. I spent your dollar. Homer looked at the sack and then at her and then back at the sack. Mrs. Cooper, he said very carefully, I gave you that dollar for the stage fare. I know, to go to Santa Fe. I know, where you were going to work for several months and then come back. I know. She straightened her spine and looked at him directly. But here is the thing, Homer. If I go to Santa Fe, I lose this fall for breaking ground, which means I lose 5 months of the growing calendar, which means when I come back in spring with money I've earned working someone else's concerns, I will be starting from behind. And every week that goes by where that land isn't being worked is a week closer to the 5-year proof-up deadline, which requires actual cultivation and improvement, not just intention. He was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his particular version of deep attention, not cold, not remote, but intensely present and very still. And she continued, because the argument was not finished and she had thought it through completely. You said you need more winter wheat seed. Your plot is larger than mine, your soil is more established, your crop rotation is already working. If you can expand your wheat acreage this season, you improve your own position significantly. She looked at the sack. I bought enough for both of us. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It had something warm in it, something that seemed to breathe. You spent my dollar on seed, he said finally, and stayed. She met his eyes. I stayed to plant it beside you, she said. If that's all right. Homer Redmond looked at Nellie Cooper for what felt like a long time, and what was in fact probably 15 seconds, but 15 seconds in which something settled between them that was more significant than either of them was prepared to name just yet. That is more than all right, he said. They shook hands on it, which was the sensible frontier way of marking an agreement, but when Homer's hand closed around hers, there was a moment, just a moment, where neither of them moved to release the handshake, and the moment stretched a beat longer than any handshake required, and the morning light was warm and yellow on the dust of the street. Then they both let go and began talking practically about plowing schedules, because that was who they both were, and because the practical conversation was safe, and the other thing that was growing between them was not quite ready to be looked at directly yet. What followed were the most extraordinary weeks of Nellie Cooper's adult life, and not simply because of the work, though the work was extraordinary in its own right. Homer lent her the spare hoe and rake as promised, and he came with her on Monday morning to begin breaking the ground on Section 12. He brought his plow horse, a big steady animal named Franklin, and the plow itself, and they broke the first acre along the creek bed where the soil was richest while Nellie worked ahead of the plow turning sod with the hoe, breaking up the heavy clumps, turning in the dried grass to feed the soil. It was hard labor, brutal in the way that physical work in the October sun is brutal, and by noon Nellie's shoulders burned and her hands had developed new blisters in new places, and she had never in her life felt more specifically purposeful. Homer watched her work without trying to redirect or manage her, which she found unusual and wonderful. He offered his opinion when she asked for it and kept it to himself when she didn't. And when she had a question about the soil structure or the drainage or the best angle for the furrows, he answered with the specific, practical knowledge of a man who had learned by doing. They ate their midday meal sitting on the ground in the shade of the cottonwoods, Nellie having packed biscuits and dried meat from Ma Guthrie's kitchen, Homer having contributed a jar of preserved peaches that he said his neighbor 3 miles east, a Mexican family named Archuleta, had given him in exchange for help repairing their well housing. The peaches were extraordinary sweet and dense with summer, and eating them under the cottonwood trees with the creek sound nearby and the plow furrows dark and promising behind them, Nellie felt something she had not felt in over a year. She felt peaceful, not merely calm, not merely functioning, but genuinely, bodily at peace in a way that lived in the muscles and the bones as much as the mind. She didn't say this to Homer. But she thought he noticed something, because he looked at her with that particular quality of attention and said, "You look like you belong here." "I think I do," she said, and was surprised by how certain she felt about it. They sowed the winter wheat the following week, when the soil was turned and rested and ready. Homer had expanded his own plot by 4 acres, using the additional seed she had bought, and they worked the 2 neighboring sections over 3 days, his in the morning, hers in the afternoon, moving together in a rhythm that felt organic, each anticipating where the other needed to be without much discussion required. Ma Guthrie, for her part, had extended Nellie's board on a running account, to be settled when the first crop sold, with an equanimity that suggested she had seen enough frontier situations to know which ones were likely to resolve well. She was also, Nellie suspected, not unaware of the arrangement that was developing between her boarder and Homer Redmond, though she expressed this awareness only through the occasional knowing look and an increased frequency of putting 2 coffee cups on the kitchen table when Homer happened to come by in the mornings. The town of Dust Creek had opinions, as small towns do. These ranged from warm Mrs. Archuleta, who came by the land one afternoon with tamales wrapped in corn husks and pronounced the plowing excellent, to skeptical, a man named Denton who ran the feed lot and had never met a woman homesteader he thought would last past the first winter, to something more complicated in the middle, from people who were genuinely uncertain what to make of Nellie Cooper, but were inclined to give her credit for the attempt. There was also the matter of a man named Roy Castor. Roy Castor owned the largest existing ranch in the immediate area, 3,000 acres to the south, with a full crew and a water rights arrangement that he had managed to secure over several other smaller claimants in the years before the homesteaders began arriving in numbers. He was not an evil man, but he was a territorial one in the specific way that men who have large things become territorial about their largeness. He did not like the homesteaders who were slowly settling the public land around his ranch, and he expressed this dislike through a combination of legal pressure and social maneuvering that stopped short of outright wrongdoing, but was not comfortable. He came to find Homer one afternoon in late October when the wheat was in the ground, and the 2 of them were repairing a section of fence on Homer's northern border. His horse, a big black quarter horse that he managed with the excessive ease of a man making sure you noticed he was good with horses. "Redmond," he said, stopping the black horse on the other side of the fence. His eyes went to Nellie, who was hammering a post back into the ground 20 feet away, and then back to Homer. "New arrangement. Mrs. Cooper has the claim on Section 12, Homer said, bending back to the fence wire without any particular change in his manner. "She's my neighbor." Roy Castor looked at Nellie again. She could feel the look and chose not to respond to it directly, continuing to work the post. "Section 12 has water access on the south end," Castor said. "I've been using that creek crossing for 12 years. "Section 12 belongs to Mrs. Cooper," Homer said simply. "I expect she'll manage the crossing reasonably." "I expect she will too," Castor said, with a particular smoothness to it that was not entirely friendly. "I just like to know who I'm dealing with in this country." He rode over to Nellie then, the black horse stepping with exaggerated care. "Ma'am, Roy Castor, I run the Double C." "I know who you are," Nellie said, stopping her work and looking up at him with her shaded eyes. "I'm Nellie Cooper. I intend to be a good neighbor, Mr. Castor. The creek crossing is yours to use as it's always been within reason. I expect the same consideration for my crops and fences." He looked at her for a moment, reassessing something. "Fair enough," he said, tipped his hat with a shade more respect than his first look had suggested, and rode south. Homer came over when Castor was gone and stood beside her, looking after the retreating horse. "That went better than I expected," he said. "He's a man who respects directness," Nellie said, going back to the fence post. "Most men like that are underneath the posture." She hammered the post with several clean strokes. "Has he given you trouble?" "Some," Homer said, taking the other end of the fence wire. "He's had 2 of my fence posts pulled up and replaced further in. I couldn't prove it was his men. His tone was measured, reporting rather than agitated. I replaced them correctly each time. He seems to have decided the expense of the ongoing argument isn't worth it. Good, she said. I'll take the same approach. She glanced at him. Did you ever think about giving up and going somewhere easier? He thought about this for a moment, working the fence wire. Yes, he said honestly. Last winter was bad. I lost a quarter of my wheat crop to early frost, and my horse was sick for 2 weeks, and I ran genuinely low on firewood before I got another load cut. He was quiet for a moment. But easy isn't really what I'm looking for. I want a thing that's worth having, and those generally aren't easy. She felt the words settle in her chest with a particular warmth. November came and the temperature dropped significantly, the nights falling below freezing regularly now, and the wheat they had planted was doing exactly what winter wheat does, sleeping under the cold soil, putting down roots, waiting. Homer had built a temporary shelter on Section 12 before the cold set in properly, a one-room structure of rough lumber with a good stove and a proper roof, and Nellie had moved out to her land to live in it, which gave her both independence and proximity to the work. Ma Guthrie had come out to see the shelter before Nellie moved in, pronounced it adequately sound, contributed a braided rug and a set of curtains she said she had no use for, and kissed Nellie on the cheek in a manner that suggested she had been watching this whole situation develop with a great deal of private satisfaction. Homer's own homestead was approximately a mile northeast, and the track between their two places became a well-worn path over the course of November and December. He came most mornings to check the progress of the land, to help with whatever work the winter allowed, cutting wood, repairing the roof of the shelter against the wind, improving the rough corral she had built for her horse, which she had purchased from the Archuleta family in a transaction that involved a great deal of respectful bargaining, and ended with everyone happy. She went to his place several afternoons a week and learned the systems he had built up over 2 years, the irrigation channel from the creek, the root cellar, the small but well-organized barn that housed Franklin and 2 other horses, and a collection of tools arranged with the precision of a man who knows that losing a tool costs more than just the tool. They talked constantly about farming and land and weather and water rights and the price of wheat in Santa Fe, about Tennessee and Kentucky, about what they had each left behind and what they were building, about books. They were both readers, which surprised neither of them once they established it. Homer had a small collection of battered volumes on a shelf in his main room, including a farmer's almanac 3 years running, a battered copy of a novel by Charles Dickens, a book on territorial land law, and a worn Bible that had belonged to his mother. Nellie had brought 2 books from Tennessee, a collection of poetry that had been her mother's, and a practical guide to soil management that she had found enormously useful. They lent each other books and argued about them in the comfortable way that people argue when they are genuinely interested in what the other person thinks. It was deep in December when Homer first said something that was not practical. They were sitting by his stove after supper she had cooked, a bean stew with dried chili that the Archuleta family had taught her to make, and the fire was low and warm, and the wind was going outside and doing nothing of concern to the solid walls of his house, and the conversation had reached one of its natural resting places, the kind that have no awkwardness in them. "I think about you in the mornings," Homer said, "before I come over, when I'm starting the fire and thinking about the day." He said it with the same measured honesty he brought to everything, but his voice had a different quality, a quieter one. She looked at him across the stove. "I think about whether you slept well," he continued, "and whether the pipes froze and what you're planning for the day." A pause, and then "I think about other things." The fire crackled softly. "What other things?" she asked, and her voice was also quiet. "I think about the way you looked at Section 12 the first time you saw it," he said. "The way you bent down and tested the soil, like you were being introduced to someone." He looked at his hands for a moment. "I think about the day you spent the $1 on seed. Every day I think about that." She felt the heat of the stove and the heat of something else entirely. "Homer," she said slowly. "I'm not trying to complicate what we have," he said, looking up at her. "I know you've had a hard year. I know you came out here to build something for yourself, and that matters, and I'm not trying to put myself in the middle of it." "You're not in the middle of it," she said. "You're beside it." She held his gaze. "There's a difference." That was all that was said on the subject that night, but it was enough. On the way home, a mile through the winter dark, which she made with a lantern and a familiarity with the path that 2 months of walking had made instinctive, she found herself smiling into the cold air, and when she reached her own door and stepped inside to her own stove, she stood for a moment in the dark before lighting her own lantern and thought. Yes, Christmas in Dust Creek was modest but not without warmth. The town gathered at the small church, a Methodist congregation led by a Reverend Altman, who was practical in his theology and genuinely good with people. And there was singing and a shared meal afterward in the social hall. And the Archuleta family brought food that was better than anything else on the table. And someone had strung dried berries as decoration. And the whole thing had the unforced warmth of people who needed each other to get through hard winters and had decided to celebrate the fact. Homer and Nellie sat beside each other in the pew, and her hand rested next to his on the wooden seat, and at some point during the third hymn, his hand covered hers, quietly and without ceremony, and she turned her palm upward and their fingers settled together, and neither of them looked at the other, both of them looking forward at the candle-lit chancel, but both of them very entirely aware of exactly where they were. After the service, walking back through the cold, clear night with the stars enormous and brilliant overhead, their breath clouding in the air, Homer said, "Come and see my place for New Year's. I'll cook." "You cook?" she said with genuine curiosity. "I manage," he said. "I won't claim expertise, but I have a recipe for a pie that works well enough to be worth attempting." "What kind of pie?" "Dried apple. It's December in the territory. We work with what we have." She laughed, and her laugh was a sound that surprised her sometimes because it was fuller than she expected it to be, bigger than the situation, and she saw him look at her when she laughed with an expression she did not try to interpret because she was busy being happy. "Yes," she said. "New Year's." In January of 1879, with the New Year clean and cold around them, things changed and also stayed the same, in the way that important things often do. The winter wheat slept under the frozen soil of 2 neighboring sections, and they both checked on it regularly, though there was nothing to see, and they both reported to each other on their checks with the particular seriousness of people waiting for something they care very much about to come through. The cold was genuine, several nights dipping well below zero, but the snowfall was moderate, and the sheltering snow that lay over the fields was actually useful, insulating the wheat roots from the worst of it. They were together most days. This was partly practical. There was always work, and 2 people could accomplish what one struggled with, and partly a habit that had grown its own necessity. Homer's morning appearances at Nellie's shelter had become something she organized her mornings around without quite acknowledging that she was doing so. His first appearance would coincide with the second pot of coffee, which she made as a matter of course now without thinking about why she made a second pot. He brought her a book he had ordered from Santa Fe, a new almanac with extensive sections on soil amendment and crop rotation that he said she would find more useful than he would, and she sewed a new pair of work gloves for him from canvas she had bought at Webb's store because his had split at the seams in the cold, and his hands were getting roughed by it. These exchanges happened without comment or ceremony, as naturally as breathing. It was February when Homer kissed her. The occasion was not romantic in its setup. They had been working on the water channel, which had iced over in a way that was creating a backup, and they were both cold and somewhat dirty, and he had just helped her chip free a large section of ice that had been obstructing the flow, and when it came loose, the water had surged back and splashed both of them thoroughly. They had looked at each other, both soaked and cold, and started laughing simultaneously, and in the middle of the laughter he had taken her face in both of his cold hands and kissed her, Just once, cleanly and warmly. And when he pulled back, they were both still laughing, but also something else entirely. "I have been intending to do that for considerably longer than is dignified to admit," he said. "Only about 3 months," she said. "Only. Homer," she said, taking one of his cold hands in both of hers and warming it. "I am going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it properly. I'm listening. When I took that dollar and spent it on seed, I wasn't being impractical. I was being exactly as practical as I ever am. Because what I was calculating when I made that decision wasn't just the growing calendar and the proof-up requirements." She looked at him steadily. "I was calculating what I would be leaving when I got on that stage." He was very still. "And the answer was too much," she said. "The answer was everything that matters." He brought her cold, wet hands up to his mouth and held them there for a moment, and the look in his eyes was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life, warm and clear and certain, like the first good day of spring. Spring, when it came in late March and then roaring into April, was as extraordinary as both of them had hoped and better than either had let themselves expect. The winter wheat emerged from the ground on a morning in early April that was the exact color and temperature of perfect hope. The green shoots thin and fragile-looking but present and consistent across both sections. And Nellie stood at the edge of her field in the early morning and felt tears on her face, which she didn't try to stop. Homer came up behind her and stood beside her looking at the field, and he didn't say anything, and she was glad he didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that the field wasn't saying better. His own wheat field, visible from where they stood, was equally green and equally extraordinary. 4 additional acres, planted with the seed she had bought with his last dollar, showing the same steady emergence. The previous year's 12 acres plus the new 4, 16 acres of winter wheat coming in strong, and on his other section, the corn ground he had prepared the previous fall, ready for spring planting. Roy Castor, who had maintained a distance but not an hostile one since October's fence line conversation, came by one afternoon in April to look at the fields with the assessing eye of a man who has been in the territory long enough to know what a good crop looks like. He looked at Nellie's wheat and then at Homer's and then at Nellie, and something in his face shifted from the original skepticism to something that was honest respect. "You know what you're doing," he said to Nellie. It was not a question. "My father farmed for 30 years in Tennessee," she said. "I was his student from the age of 4. Said Castor. He looked at Homer. "The channel work you did in February improved the downstream flow considerably. It helped my south pasture." "Glad to hear it," Homer said. Castor nodded, as much communication as he was generally willing to commit to, and rode south. Homer looked at Nellie after he was gone with the slight warmth around his eyes that was his particular version of amusement. "You've managed Roy Castor," he said, "which is something I have not entirely managed in 2 years." "I haven't managed him," she said. "I've just been consistent. Consistent is difficult to argue with." By May, the wheat was tall enough to see from a distance, and the kitchen garden she had planted along the southern slope was coming in with the particular enthusiasm of soil that had been waiting to produce something. She had tomatoes, beans, squash, onions, and a small plot of herbs that she tended with special attention, because good herbs made everything else worth eating. Homer had helped her build a proper cabin in April, not the rough temporary shelter but a real structure, squared timber and a solid foundation and 2 rooms, a large main room and a bedroom, with a proper stone fireplace and windows with actual glass he had freighted out from Santa Fe at a cost that he tried to minimize in the telling, and that she knew was significant. "You didn't have to do that," she told him, meaning the windows. "Glass windows are not a luxury," he said firmly. "Light in winter is necessary for health and sanity." "That is a practical statement, not a romantic one." "Of course," she said, and let him believe she accepted this characterization. She did not accept this characterization. They were, by May, obviously in love. The word had not been said yet in the specific 4-letter format, but it was present in every conversation and every meal and every morning and every evening, and the people of Dust Creek, who noticed these things, had largely come to accept the situation with a warmth that the town reserved for things it felt proprietary about. Ma Guthrie had told Mrs. Archuleta about the dollar and the seed, and Mrs. Archuleta had told her husband, and the story had spread in the way that good stories do, gently and warmly, and gaining no embellishment because it needed none. It was the Reverend Altman who brought the matter to a head, in his characteristically practical way. He appeared at Homer's place one Saturday morning in May when Homer and Nellie were working the corn ground together, and stood at the edge of the field until they came to him, both of them dusty and squinting in the morning light. "I have a question for both of you," the Reverend said without preamble, because he was not a man for preamble. "Are you planning to get married, or are you planning to keep the whole town in a state of collective suspense through the entire growing season?" Homer looked at Nellie. Nellie looked at Homer. "The second option seems inconsiderate," Homer said. "It does," Nellie agreed. "I could do it Sunday," the Reverend said. "After service. Simple ceremony, no fuss." Homer looked at Nellie properly then, and she saw in his face everything she needed to see. She had not needed a large gesture or a formal occasion. She had needed exactly what she was seeing, that steady, certain, warm regard. "Sunday," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the way he had in the church at Christmas, fingers settling together with the ease of long practice. "Sunday," he said. They were married on a Sunday in May of 1879, in the small Methodist church in Dust Creek, with the Reverend Altman officiating and Ma Guthrie in the front row with her best hat and visibly wet eyes that she would have denied if challenged, and the Archuleta family filling 2 pews, and several other neighbors and townspeople making up the rest, including Roy Castor, who appeared in the back row without having been particularly invited, and who left quietly afterward, but had shaken Homer's hand on the church steps with genuine warmth. Nellie wore her best dress, which was a blue cotton that she had purchased in Santa Fe and carefully preserved for significant occasions, and she carried a small bunch of wild larkspur that Mrs. Archuleta had collected that morning from the hillside. Homer had gotten his suit jacket pressed at the laundry, and wore a collar that was considerably whiter than his usual work shirts, and he looked at her when she walked up the aisle of the small church with an expression that was so open and so certain that she had to concentrate carefully to keep her own composure. The ceremony was simple and short and exactly right. The celebration afterward was at the Archuleta family's place. Elena Archuleta, who was the matriarch of that large and generous family, had insisted and could not be argued with, and there was food that was extraordinary, music from 2 guitars and a fiddle, and dancing in the yard under strings of paper lanterns that someone had made, and the evening light over the territory was purple and gold, and the stars came out one by one while they danced. And Homer held her close and moved with the particular careful grace of a man who is not a natural dancer, but is very much paying attention to the person in his arms. "Want to tell you something," he said quietly when they were moving through a slow turn on the edge of the dance area. "Tell me. That dollar," he said, "the day I gave it to you. Yes, I told you it was for the stage fare, I remember. I want you to know that when I put it in your hand, part of me, a significant part, was hoping you would find a reason to stay." His voice was low and honest and steady. "I would never have asked it, but I hoped it." She looked up at him. "And the other part?" "The other part genuinely wanted you to have what you needed, even if that was the stage." "I know," she said. "That's why I stayed." He looked at her with such complete regard that she had to say something before the moment became too large to hold. "I chose the seed," she said, "but I was also choosing you. I want you to know that. It was both things." He pressed his lips to her forehead, right there on the edge of the dance floor with the fiddle playing and the stars emerging and the warm desert night all around them. "I know," he said. "I know it was." The summer of 1879 was the summer that defined Dust Creek for the next generation of its residents. Because in that summer something that had been struggling and uncertain about the homesteading community crystallized into something viable and real. The wheat harvest in July was exceptional, not merely adequate, not merely surviving, but genuinely excellent, the kind of harvest that people talk about as a reference point for years afterward. Homer's 16 acres yielded more than he had allowed himself to expect. Nellie's 12 acres. She had gotten more under cultivation than she had originally planned, because she had worked like someone with a profound personal stake in the outcome, which she was yielded proportionally even better, the soil along the creek producing at a rate that made Mr. Webb's eyes widen when he saw the samples she brought into town. They harvested together, hiring 2 hands from town for the most intensive week of cutting and thrashing, and worked beside them from sunrise to past sundown. And at the end of each day they came home to the cabin with the smell of cut wheat on them and cooked supper together at the stove. And it was ordinary, and it was extraordinary in the way that the best domestic life always is. With the proceeds of the harvest, she paid Ma Guthrie's account in full, with a jar of preserved tomatoes added as a token of genuine gratitude. Ma Guthrie accepted both and told Nellie, in the particular way she had of delivering a compliment sideways and gruffly, like it had escaped without her permission, that she was glad the stage had run on Fridays that year. The fall brought the second planting expanded again, another 8 acres brought under the plow across the 2 sections, and the kitchen garden put to bed with a thick layer of the cottonwood leaves that drifted down through October, and also a winter that was gentler than the previous one, as though the territory was rewarding them for having survived the harder tests. There was something else in the fall, something that Nellie told Homer one evening in October, sitting by the stove with the lamplight warm around them and the first frost cracking the windows. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions: surprise, then something that settled into joy that was so genuine and so large it nearly embarrassed him. He pulled her to him and held her with such careful, deliberate care that she laughed at the gentleness of it. "Homer, I am not made of glass," she said into his shoulder. "No," he agreed, holding on. "You are made of considerably sterner stuff, but allow me a moment." She allowed him his moment. Their son was born in June of 1880, a healthy and substantial boy with Homer's dark coloring and Nellie's stubborn jaw, and they named him William James Redmond, William for Homer's father, the surveyor from Kentucky, and James as a quiet, respectful acknowledgment of what Nellie had been before. Mrs. Elena Archuleta attended the birth, having considerable practical experience in such matters, and afterward held the baby with the authority of a woman who has held many babies and knows exactly what she is looking at. "Strong one," Elena said, in her direct and certain manner. "He will give you trouble." "He comes by it honestly," Homer said, from where he was standing very close to Nellie's bedside and had not moved more than 3 feet from her since the previous evening. Nellie laughed, tired and full of light. "From which side exactly?" "Equal contribution," he said. William James Redmond did give them trouble, in the rich and wonderful way that healthy, curious, determined children give trouble. He walked at 10 months, and immediately applied his ambulation to the project of reaching all things that were placed out of his reach, which led to considerable rearrangement of household geography. He had his mother's love of the soil. At 2 years old he could be found sitting in the kitchen garden turning dirt in his small hands, with the evaluating expression of someone conducting a serious assessment, and his father's habit of stillness and observation, of watching something for a long time before acting on it. By 1881, the Redmond homestead, which was how people in Dust Creek referred to both sections together, treating them as the unit they had functionally become, was producing enough that they hired a permanent hand, a young man of 19 named Tomás, who was the youngest of the Archuleta boys and had grown up in the agricultural rhythms of the valley, and was willing and quick to learn. Homer taught him the surveying techniques, because teaching was something Homer did naturally, and Nellie taught him the soil management principles her father had passed to her. And Tamaz became, over the years, something that was more than an employee and less than family, only by the most technical of definitions. The proof-up requirements of the Homestead Act required 5 years of cultivation and improvement, and both sections, Homer's in 1883, Nellie's in 1884, each reaching its 5-year mark from original filing, completed their required demonstrations. The government inspectors who came out found 2 sections of land that were, in the inspector's formal written report, substantially and demonstrably improved, with evidence of sustained agricultural cultivation, permanent structures in good repair, and water management infrastructure indicative of serious long-term commitment. In the year Nellie's section proved up, she and Homer sat together on the porch of the cabin, which had been expanded now, a proper second room added and a covered porch running along the south face, with climbing roses that Alina Archuleta had given her the year before just beginning to take hold on the porch post, and she held the proof-up certificate in both hands, the same way she had held the homestead approval 6 years earlier, and read it through twice. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. She looked at him. "Do you remember sitting outside the general store, every day? I was so determined to be sensible," she said, looking at the certificate, "to be practical. To go to Santa Fe and come back with money and do everything correctly and in order. And then you were more practical," he said. She looked at him. Was it practical? He thought about it with the genuine consideration he gave to real questions. "It was the most practical thing either of us has ever done," he said. "The alternative was you going away and me being $1 richer and everything less." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture she had been making for 5 years without it losing any of its meaning. William, 3 years old and thorough in his projects, was in the kitchen garden with Tamaz, conducting what appeared to be a very serious investigation of the bean rows. "I want to plant the north field next year," she said. "The higher ground. I've been testing the soil up there and it will take oats." "I was thinking the same," he said. "We can run the oats beside the wheat rotation and give the creek field a year of rest." "Exactly what I was calculating." She lifted her head and looked at him with the particular delight she still took in the fact that their minds ran along parallel lines. "Homer, Nellie, do you know what I think about every time I look at those wheat fields?" "Tell me." "I think about the fact that it started with $1, she said. "That all of this," she gestured, not at any one thing but at the broad sweep of the land, the fields, the cabin, the corral, the garden, the mountains beyond, the whole of it, started with $1 that you gave me without condition and that I spent on seed." "And stayed," he said. "And stayed," she said, "to plant it beside you." He took her hand, the way he always did, fingers settling with the ease of 10,000 repetitions that had not made the gesture ordinary, only more itself, more specific and exact and right. "Best dollar I ever spent," he said. She laughed, and the sound of it went out over the October afternoon, over the ripening fields and the cottonwood trees that were turning gold along the creek and the wide territory sky, where the clouds were building over the northern mountains. William looked up from his bean row investigation and shouted something at them that was more enthusiasm than articulate speech, and Tamaz looked up too and grinned from under his hat brim, and the sun was warm and declining and golden over all of it. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1883, and they named her Margaret Alina Margaret for Nellie's mother and Alina for the woman who had been present at both their births and had fed them at her table more times than could be counted. Margaret was fair where William was dark, and she had Homer's patient quality of attention from her earliest months, watching the world with steady, serious eyes before deciding to participate in it. The year of 1884 brought challenges and also changes, as years do. The freight company that served the territory raised its rates again, and the price of milled goods in the town went up accordingly, which tightened the margins on crops that were sold through local buyers. Homer spent 2 weeks that winter corresponding with a grain merchant in Albuquerque who offered better prices for direct delivery, and eventually established an arrangement that cut out the local middleman and improved their revenue enough to matter. Nellie, who had a head for figures that she had not initially disclosed, but which Homer had discovered when he saw her account books, handled the correspondence with the Albuquerque merchant thereafter with a precision that the merchant, whose name was Gustavo Herrera, clearly respected. Gustavo Herrera also turned out to be the connection that opened up a larger market for Nellie's preserved goods. The tomatoes and beans and dried herbs she had been producing from the kitchen garden had become, over the years, a more significant operation than the term kitchen garden implied, and through Herrera's network, she began selling preserved goods to hotels and restaurants in Albuquerque and eventually Santa Fe, which added a steady and not inconsequential income stream that had not been part of the original plan. "This is what happens," Homer said one evening, looking over the accounts with her, "when you buy tomato seeds with money that wasn't quite meant for tomato seeds." "I bought those seeds with my own 5 cents," she said. "That was before the dollar. The 5 cents are the founding investment," he said, "and the dollar was the expansion capital." She looked at him, and the look had laughter in it and also something warmer and deeper than laughter. "Is that what you've decided? Financial history," he said. "I'm committed to the record." Roy Castor died in 1885 of a stroke that his foreman found him in the aftermath of on a Tuesday morning in April, and his ranch went to his nephew from Texas, a younger man named Garrett who had been raised differently and was considerably more neighborly from the beginning. Garrett Castor came to see Homer and Nellie in his first week and introduced himself with a directness that they both found genuinely easy to respond to, and the relationship between the Redmond homestead and the Double C Ranch, which had always been one of managed courtesy, became one of actual practical cooperation. Garrett Castor had cattle. Nellie had kitchen gardens that produced more than they could use. The arrangement worked naturally and to everyone's benefit. William, at 5 years old in 1885, began helping with the real farm work in the earnest way of a child who has not yet been told that the work is hard, and so approaches it as simply interesting. He followed Homer through the fields with the same focus that Homer brought to everything, and Homer taught him, patiently, in the specific detailed way he taught everything, about the soil and the water and the seed, and the way the weather worked in the territory, and how to read the signs of it. Nellie taught him the kitchen garden, the preservation work, the account books. He learned both with the unself-conscious eagerness of a child who does not yet know that people are supposed to be one thing rather than multiple things. Margaret, at 2, had decided that the chickens were her primary concern, and managed them with a proprietary authority that suggested she had very clear ideas about poultry governance. The 5th anniversary of their wedding fell on a Sunday in May of 1884, and the Archuleta family organized, without being asked and without taking no for an answer, a gathering at their place that was essentially a reconstruction of the wedding celebration, including the paper lanterns and the guitars and the fiddle, though the fiddle player was now the second Archuleta son rather than the first, who had moved to Albuquerque. Homer danced better than he had at the wedding, which Nellie noticed and commented on and which he attributed to practice. "I've been practicing for 5 years," he said, "specifically for this occasion." "You have not." "I have," he said. "Every time I thought about the wedding, I thought about how I could have done the dancing better, and I practiced mentally." She looked at him with the particular fondness that 5 years had not diminished but deepened, the way roots deepen over years and make the tree more stable. "Homer Redmond," she said, "you are the most quietly romantic man I have ever known." "I have my moments," he said. He did. He had moments of quiet romance that were better than anyone else's large gestures. The book ordered from Albuquerque and left on her desk without comment. the bunch of wild larkspur that appeared on the kitchen table on the anniversary of the first time they rode out to Section 12 together, the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of the farm work and looked at her across the field with an expression that required no interpretation. By 1886, the homestead had been in operation for 8 years, and it was demonstrably, undeniably, substantially thriving. The two sections together represented the most productive per-acre farmland in the immediate valley, according to the county assessor, who noted it in his records with the civil servant's particular lack of drama. The cabin had grown into a house with 4 rooms and a proper kitchen, and the porch with its climbing roses, which now covered 2 posts and cascaded in the summer with pink and white flowers that Nellie cut and put in a jar on the table where they lasted 3 days, and where Homer looked at them with a pleasure he expressed by saying that the house smelled better in rose season. Homer had built a proper barn in 1882 and a second, smaller structure for the farm equipment in 1885, and the fields extended in a sweep across both sections that was visible from the road into Dust Creek, and had become something of a landmark in the way that thriving things become landmarks. People used it as a reference point when giving directions, past the Redmond fields being a more reliable marker than any other landmark in the immediate area. Tomás Archuleta, who had been their farm hand since 1881, had grown from a 19-year-old eager to learn into a 24-year-old who knew as much about the soil and water management of those 2 sections as anyone, and who had in the past year fallen in love with a girl named Resita from a family in the next valley, and who Homer had formally offered a portion of wages as a profit share, recognizing that his contribution had long outgrown the category of hired hand. Tomás had received this offer with a dignity and gratitude that moved Homer and Nellie both, and the partnership, because that was what it was, though the formal documents called it something more modest, was understood to be the arrangement going forward. William started school in Dust Creek in 1886, riding the 3 miles into town on a small bay pony that Homer had trained for him through the summer with the patient consistency he brought to all training, and he came home every afternoon with the same serious face, and a head full of new information that he delivered at the supper table with complete solemnity. He was, his teacher reported to Nellie when she came in for the seasonal assessment, an exceptional student particularly in arithmetic, which he approached with his mother's precision, and in the natural sciences which he approached with his father's thoroughness. He is sometimes impatient with the pace of the class, the teacher added, with a diplomat's care. He comes by that honestly, Nellie said, with a look toward Homer that he caught and answered with the slight warmth around his eyes that was his smile. The teacher was right that William was sometimes impatient, but it was not the impatience of arrogance. It was the impatience of someone whose mind moved faster than the available content. Homer understood this precisely, because his own mind operated the same way, and he managed it in William the way it had eventually been managed in him, by providing more content. He taught William surveying on the weekends, the way his father had taught him, setting up the transit and teaching the calculations with careful precision. Nellie taught him soil chemistry from her soil management book, expanded now with 8 years of margin notes in her own hand, and began teaching him the account books. Margaret, who would start school the following year, had added to her poultry concerns a deep and specific interest in the climbing roses and the kitchen herb garden, which she tended with a care that made Nellie think of her own 4-year-old self following her father through the fields of Tennessee. The thought was warm rather than sad, most of the time. Sometimes, on certain evenings in certain seasons, it was both. In the summer of 1886, Nellie took William and Margaret to Santa Fe for 5 days, the first time she had been back to the city since she had arrived in the territory 8 years earlier. She had 2 purposes: a meeting with Gustavo Herrera about expanding the preserved goods arrangement, which had become significant enough to warrant a face-to-face discussion, and a particular errand that she had not told Homer about. The errand was at a bookseller on the main street in Santa Fe, where she had ordered, several months earlier, a surveying textbook and a companion guide on land measurement that she had tracked down through a correspondence with a university press. She had them wrapped in paper and ribbon and packed carefully for the journey home, and on the evening she returned, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, she put the package on the table in front of Homer. He looked at her and then at the package. "Open it," she said. He opened it with the careful thoroughness he brought to things, not slow but precise, and when he saw what was inside he was quiet for a moment, running his hands over the covers. "Nellie," he said. "You taught William surveying this spring," she said, sitting across from him at the table. "He told me you said you wished you had better materials. That your father's teaching was excellent but you never had the textbooks to go alongside it." She watched him. "I found the best ones available." He looked up from the books. There was something in his expression that was very open, the way it had been on the bench outside the general store the morning she had come back with the seed, and she felt the same warmth from that openness that she had felt then. "You were listening," he said. "I always listen," she said. "That's how I knew to buy the seed." He laughed low and warm and reached across the table and took her hand. "8 years," he said. "8 years," she confirmed. "From $1, he said. She looked at him across the table, at the man who had put his last dollar in her hand and meant it as a gift without condition, at the man who had walked her to Ma Guthrie's door with her bag, and come back to show her the land, and then come back again, and then never really stopped coming back, at the man who had plowed her fields and mended her fences and danced at her wedding and held her hand in church and been absolutely, unwaveringly present in a way she had not known to expect and had not expected, and which had made all the difference. From $1 and one woman who had decided to stay. "We grew a great deal from that seed," she said. He squeezed her hand. "The best crop of my life." The years that followed carried the particular richness of a life that has been genuinely built, not discovered or inherited or stumbled into, but constructed, deliberately, with labor and decision, and the kind of love that is not merely feeling but practice. Homer taught William the surveying and later the land law and the practical mechanics of running a farm operation. Nellie taught Margaret the soil and the garden and the accounts, and when it became clear that Margaret's interest ran also to the cooking and preservation side, taught her everything about that as well with the same thoroughness her father had taught her, holding nothing back because there was nothing in her knowledge she valued more than its transmission. The wheat fields became well known enough that other homesteaders in the area came to Homer and Nellie for advice, which they gave freely, and in the specific, practical detail that was actually useful, not the vague encouragement that substitutes for knowledge. Nellie began keeping a detailed farming journal in 1882 that by 1887 was 5 volumes of closely written notes on soil management, planting schedules, water management, crop rotation, and the management of specific pests and blights that affected the territory. And she lent these notebooks to any neighbor who asked, and eventually, at the insistence of Reverend Altman, who had a broader view of their value than she did, sent copies of the key sections to the Territorial Agricultural Office in Santa Fe, where they were received with considerable interest. In 1888, with William 8 years old and Margaret 5, and the farm operation in the best position it had ever been, Nellie sat down one evening in September and wrote in her journal, not about the crops or the soil or the water, but about the decision she had made on a Saturday morning in October of 1878, standing outside a general store in Dust Creek with a paper sack of seed on her knees. She wrote, "I have thought many times about what I would have done if the stage had run a different day. If the dollar had been offered on a Thursday and the Friday stage had been imminent rather than a week away, if I had had less time to think, if the seed had cost more or the need had seemed less. I think I would still have stayed. I think the calculus was always going to resolve the same way, because the thing I was choosing was not the seed. The seed was how I chose it, but what I was choosing was this land and this life and this man who put his last dollar in my hand without condition and meant it as freedom, not obligation. He gave me the choice. I chose to stay. And every day since, I have found that staying was the bravest and most practical and most entirely right thing I have ever done. She closed the journal and set it on the shelf and went to find Homer, who was on the porch in the September evening watching the last light fade over the fields. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching, and they watched the fields go dark together, the wheat invisible now but present, and the stars beginning in the wide sky, and the smell of sage and coming autumn on the air. "I was just writing in the journal," she said. "Anything interesting. My recollections of 1878. He looked at her sidelong, and the lamp from the house caught the amber in his dark eyes. And I was right about the seed," she said. "I want you to know that formally. My decision was correct." He made a sound that was low and warm and was his version of laughter when something moved him too much for actual laughter. "Formally," he said. "Formally," she confirmed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the porch was solid under them. The porch he had built with his own hands on the house they had made together on the land she had stayed to plant. In town, lights were coming on in the windows of Dusk Creek, the Archuleta family's place, visible as a warm square of light in the near distance. Ma Guthrie's boarding house, where Nellie had held her $1.43 and tried to think practically about her situation. The general store where she had spent the dollar and come back with a paper sack full of seed, and a decision already made. The territory was darker and wider and vaster than anything she had grown up knowing, and it was hers and it was his and it was theirs together, and it had started with $1 and one decision and a man who had put his hand under hers and said the most important thing anyone had ever said to her, which was simply, "Take it if you need it, no conditions attached." She had needed it. She had taken it. She had spent it on seed and stayed to plant it beside him. And from that single dollar, from that single decision, from two people who had each separately decided that the territory was worth the risk and who had found each other at the edge of it, something had grown that neither of them, even in their most hopeful moments, could have fully imagined. The field stretched dark and patient under the September stars. The roses on the porch post had dropped their last summer blooms but would return, as they always did, in the spring. Inside the house, William was reading by lamplight and Margaret was asleep with her small face turned toward the window and the sound of the night. And Tamaz had gone home to Reseda and their own small house at the edge of the Archuleta land. And in the cool September air, the whole place breathed with the particular piece of things that have been properly, thoroughly made. Homer Redmond held his wife in the good dark and looked out over the land they had built together from a dollar and a seed and a decision to stay. And he thought, as he thought every day, that it was the finest country he had ever seen. Nellie Cooper Redmond rested her head against his shoulder and listened to the territory at night, and felt the solid porch under her and the solid man beside her, and thought, as she thought every day, that the most practical decision she had ever made was the one that had looked from the outside the most impractical. She had not taken the stage. She had spent the dollar on seed. She had stayed to plant it beside him. And everything, the wheat fields and the kitchen garden and the cabin with its climbing roses and the children inside it, and the years of mornings and evenings and hard work and good meals and quiet conversations, and the way he looked at her across a plowed field, and the way she knew, every single day, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, everything had grown from that. She would have traded none of it. She would not have traded one single morning. The stars were enormous and the territory was vast and the night was cool and coming, and they stayed on the porch a long time, the two of them, not needing to speak, because they had already said everything, and would go on saying it every day, in every ordinary and extraordinary way available to people who have built a life together from the ground up and know, with the bone-deep certainty of farmers who understand what it means for a thing to take root, that what they have planted will not fail. It would grow. It always grew. It grew from $1 and one decision, and one woman who looked at good soil and chose to stay, and one man who had given away everything he had because someone else's beginning mattered as much to him as his own, and who had gotten back in return everything worth having. The wheat would come up green in the spring, as it always did. The roses would bloom on the porch post, as they always did. William would ride to school on his bay pony and come home full of arithmetic and questions, as he always did. Margaret would tend her chickens and her herbs with her mother's exactness and her father's patience, as she always did. And Homer and Nellie Redmond would work their land and their life together, side by side, as they always did, as they intended always to do, in the wide and patient and beautiful territory under its enormous sky, where they had found each other at the edge of everything, and had decided, separately and together, to stay.